after a year and a half in Paris, I got a Fulbright to Italy. And while I was there, I was painting squares, grids, with a stopwatch, kind of out of Duchamp. And I'd have buckets randomly on the floor, and I would paint as many grids as I could in a given period of time. And then I went one day to the library, and I saw a Kelly, and it looked like what I had done yesterday, and I thought, I can't do that anymore. And then I made a trip to, with a really interesting guy named Johnny Weiss, who was a philosophy student at Yale, and we made a trip to see Las Meninas. And I was standing in front of Las Meninas, and I was looking at the painting, and I thought, geez, Velázquez is looking at me. And I thought that there was like a scrim between myself and the painting. And I thought, I'm occupying a space that's a projection of the space that's in front of me. And what occurred to me is that I was implicated in the space of the painting as a viewer. Now, if you look at most paintings, the content of the painting is the representation of the painting within the frame. It's not the representation of you being a subject in the frame, unless there's a mirror as a reflection or whatever. And I think some of the early Dutch tried to do it. Here, I kept looking at this painting and kept thinking, I'm implicated in the space by standing right where I am, and there's a projection of that space, not only inward as a perspectival all the way back to the door of the man who's stepping into the painting, but the La Infanta and Velázquez, he is looking at me, and I'm implicated in that space, and I've become the subject of that picture. And my experience is the subject of, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm not going to be able to do that in painting. Now, first of all, I'm not going to be able to do what Velázquez could do between his eye, his shoulder, and his hand. I didn't have that kind of facility. That alone frightened me. But the fact that I was never going to be able to make myself the subject included in the implication of this space really set me thinking about how I could find a way out of that situation. And I was driving back with Johnny Weiss, who was a really interesting person to play off of because he had a really quick mind. And I came to the conclusion with him in the car driving back, I was going to drop my painting. I was going to quit painting, stop.
Stop, yeah.
And I got back to Florence, took all my paintings, threw them in the Arno. Yeah. Not only did I throw all my paintings in the Arno, I threw all my brushes and all my color in the Arno. I decided that's over. I'm not going to do that anymore. And that's if you're a student, and you know, I went from English literature to a painting student to seeing Brancusi and Giacometti to seeing Velázquez and saying, I've reached a point where I can't go on. I really have to do something else because I can see that for what I want to do, if I want to be the subject of the experience of something in space, I'm going to have to do it in 3 dimensions. And I really didn't know where to begin. So I started, it sounds bizarre, I started stuffing dead animals, and I started juxtaposing with live animals. And I started making surrogate zoos. And the whole thing was trying to get away from the trappings of my education, trying to just get it all behind me. And it seemed like at one point we were living with 22 live animals in the room, and we were giving them different...
Yeah, the show was in Rome.
Yeah, and it was completely hysterical. And it was student experimental work. And it was probably involved with a kind of surrealist Dada, and I really didn't... Art de Pauvre, but it came before Art de Pauvre, actually. It came, not that I didn't know those people. Pinto Pasquale actually became a friend of mine. But Cunellis hadn't shown his parrot, and he hadn't shown his horses. So the idea of introducing animals into the mix really wasn't a possibility. I didn't have any intention of going on making that kind of work. I thought it was an interesting thing, and I called it student work. I didn't even call it works of art. I thought this is student work. This is ending my Fulbright, sojourn in Europe. But what it did is it introduced me into the possibility of using diverse materials. And then when I got back to New York, there was a place that stored and cut rubber right around the corner. And they were going out of business. And they emptied out tons of rubber on the street, tons. And they had these big carts that were coming along and picking it up with a forklift and dumping it in their truck. And I phoned the CEO of the head of the company, and I said, can I take what I can get? He said, you can take as much as you want. So myself and Phil Glass and Chuck Close and Michael Snow and a few other people took, maybe a room full like this of rubber. up into my loft, and it was like getting a grant of material. And so then I started lifting rubber, cutting rubber. I wrote down a verb list of how to perform activities in relation to the rubber, and that pretty much got me into some potential of making things in 3 dimensions. Not that I thought that I was making sculpture, but I thought I was making something other than what other people had made. And that seemed to be in itself gratifying.
Okay, we have an example in the exhibition.
Pardon?
We have an example in the exhibition of these rubber works.
Yeah, there's one upstairs,
early,
actually.
Early,
yeah.
very early,
yeah.
68 or so,
yeah.
rubber works.
Yeah. That one, the subtext of that is that when I was a student and I was involved with painting, the person who I really thought had broken open painting in the United States was Pollock. And I was very, very much involved with kind of mimicking Pollock. And Pollock had done a painting called the Iowa State Mural, which if you look at it is figures, although they're very, very, very abstract, and almost a serial representation as they go across the painting. And the painting's probably about 24 feet long, it's about 10 feet high. And I tacked the painting on the wall, and I thought that I would make the painting in 3 dimensions with pieces of rubber. I actually thought everybody would realize that that's what I was doing. No, I mean, that's in my mind's eye. Because you're dealing with a model in front of you, you think everybody's going to understand the transparency of that transformation. But to my chagrin, people thought that I was doing horse harnesses. I mean, when the pieces were first shown, and no one related it to Pollock.
To Pollock, yeah.
Nor did they see it that way. But that was the implication, to try to find a way of drawing with a material that was flexible. And the interesting thing about it is that when I was doing it, and I had to cross the pieces of rubber, and every place where the rubber crossed, I had to make a fasten. I had to take a nail and bend it and push it through the rubber to hold the rubber in place. What was interesting about the making the rubber and hanging of the rubber is gravity occurred. And when gravity occurs, gravity is really not a tectonic principle that's used in making architecture unless you go back to something like the keystone or the cantilever, or there may be other ways that gravity is used as a force in architecture, but hardly ever because of its tendency to overturn. People don't make architecture without a fixed joint because of the impossibility of earthquake codes and permits or whatever. But I wanted to go back to the tectonics of building. And gravity as a force allows you to take things like the house of cards, lift it up, put them together without a fastened joint. And at that time, I was also interested in the Doragis in Sardinia, and dolmens, and like really the principles of the tectonics of building. And I had, as a kid, I'd worked in steel mills catching rivets and sticking rivets. So I had an idea of how steel had been used in the Industrial Revolution. But in terms of looking at the history of sculpture in relation to steel, it hadn't been used that way. Basically, from Gonzalez to Picasso to Calder to David Smith, the tectonics of the constructions were false because basically you had an armature and then they were bolted into the ground, and if they held out the planes in space, they weren't true to the logics of the building because the armature is what was holding them in place and the balance was kind of fake. And I wanted to really go back to things that were self-sustaining within the logic of their own construction. And so I kind of invented ways of building without fixed joints.